For over 2 decades, television viewers watched Jeremy Clarkson do something that nobody thought twice about. Somewhere between the car chases, the engine specs, and the arguments with Richard Hammond and James May, there was always a pub, always a bar, always a drink. It looked like comic relief, a few minutes to breathe between challenges. Nobody watching at the time thought they were looking at anything more than a joke. But here's the thing nobody noticed. That joke didn't happen once. It happened again and again and again, in country after country, for over 20 years. And when you line up every one of those moments side by side, they stop looking like comedy. They start looking like research. Today, Jeremy Clarkson runs a beer brand worth tens of millions of pounds. He runs a pub. He turned down a £50 million offer from one of the biggest brewers in the world because he thought his own business was worth more. And the question almost nobody is asking is simple. Where did that instinct actually come from? This video is about to show you that it didn't start at Diddley Squat Farm. It started decades earlier on television, hiding in plain sight. Let's start with the pattern. Across years of car shows, whenever Clarkson, Hammond, and May traveled somewhere new, a pub or a bar always found its way into the story. Sometimes it was the finish line of a race. The actual goal of a challenge was simply to reach a pub before it closed. Sometimes it was a stop in the middle of nowhere, halfway around the world, where the presenters would sit down with a drink and just talk. Sometimes it was a legendary bar with real history behind it, a place where journalists once gathered during difficult times in a country's past, the kind of bar that has stories baked into its walls. And sometimes it was something even bigger than a single bar, an entire episode built around a country's relationship with wine, its traditions, its culture, and what that drink meant to the people who made it. On the surface, none of this looked connected. It was just Clarkson being Clarkson, chasing a laugh, filling time, keeping the mood light. But strip away the comedy for a second, and look at what was actually being filmed. A local pub built around community and shared identity. A bar built entirely around story and exclusivity. A drink built around centuries of tradition tied to one specific piece of land. Those aren't 3 random bits of travel content. Those are 3 separate case studies in what makes a drinks brand actually mean something to people. And that's where this gets interesting. Fast forward to today, and look at what Jeremy Clarkson has actually built. The Farmer's Dog isn't just a pub attached to a farm. It's built entirely around local identity, around being the community's local, around the feeling of belonging somewhere. Hawkstone Beer isn't just a beer with Clarkson's face on the label. It's built around a story, around the idea of a farmer growing his own barley in a shed because nobody else believed in it. And every product connected to Diddley Squat Farm is tied to one specific piece of land in the Cotswolds, the same way that Georgian wine is tied to the land it's grown on. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it's the exact same 3 ingredients Clarkson was quietly studying on television for 20 years before he ever built a single one of these businesses himself. Now, you could call that a coincidence. People are allowed to enjoy pubs without secretly running a business plan in their head the whole time. But when the pattern repeats this many times, across this many years, and then reappears almost exactly in the businesses someone eventually builds, coincidence starts to feel like the less likely explanation. Let's talk about how this actually played out in real life. We've covered before on this channel how Hawkstone Beer started as a shed full of barley that nobody thought was worth anything, back in 2020. That barley eventually turned into a brewing operation worth an estimated £75 million. Along the way, Carlsberg, one of the largest brewing companies on the planet, offered Clarkson £50 million to buy the brand outright. He turned it down. Not after months of negotiation. Not after a bidding war. He turned it down almost immediately. Think about how unusual that decision actually is. Most people, offered £50 million for something they built from nothing, would take the deal without blinking. Clarkson didn't. And the usual explanation people give is that it's about pride, or stubbornness, or simply not needing the money. But there's a much simpler explanation sitting right there in his own broadcasting history. He understood, better than almost anyone negotiating that deal, exactly what made the brand work in the first place, because he'd spent 20 years studying what makes drinks brands and pubs actually connect with people. Selling to Carlsberg wouldn't have just been selling a business. It would have handed over something built on authenticity to a company that, by its very size, cannot replicate authenticity. He understood that trade-off instinctively, because he'd effectively been researching it his entire career without ever calling it research. This is also why Hawkstone and the Farmer's Dog didn't feel like a celebrity cash grab. There's a very specific reason audiences didn't roll their eyes when Clarkson launched a beer brand, the way they might roll their eyes at yet another celebrity vodka or yet another celebrity clothing line. Those products usually feel bolted on, a famous face slapped onto a generic product with no real connection to anything. Hawkstone didn't feel like that. The Farmer's Dog didn't feel like that. They felt built from the ground up, rooted in a specific place, with a story that made sense. And now you can see exactly why. Clarkson wasn't guessing at what makes a drinks brand feel real. He had, whether he ever admitted it or not, spent decades absorbing the difference between a brand that feels manufactured and a brand that feels like it belongs somewhere. That difference is exactly what separates Hawkstone from a forgettable celebrity side project. And this pattern doesn't stop at the beer and the pub. Widen the lens even further, and the same logic applies to the rest of the diddly squat empire. The farm shop, the beef business. Every part of it looks, from the outside, like a series of happy accidents. A farmer stumbling into success almost by chance, tripping over one lucky break after another. But if you've watched this channel before, you already know that's not how this story actually works. Every part of Diddly Squat Farm that looks accidental on the surface has a structural reason sitting underneath it. Clarkson's television career wasn't separate from his farm business. It was training for it, even if nobody, including Clarkson himself, ever framed it that way at the time. So here's the real takeaway. The biggest business lesson hiding inside the Diddly Squat story isn't buried in a spreadsheet, and it isn't hiding in some private filing nobody has access to. It's sitting in decades of television footage that millions of people have already watched, laughed at, and completely dismissed as comedy. The pub race, the Arctic beer stop, the bar with the history, the wine country episode. None of it was ever just a joke. It was, quietly and without anyone noticing at the time, 20 years of market research. And it's exactly why, when Clarkson finally built a real drinks business of his own, it worked. Before you go, here's something worth thinking about. If a handful of throwaway pub scenes from decades ago turned out to be this important, what else got dismissed as comedy the first time around that actually mattered? That's worth sitting with, because if this channel has shown you anything, it's that almost nothing at Diddly Squat Farm happens completely by accident.